Hi, I'm Yoavais, and just a few words about myself. I've been working as part of the Responsive Images community group in my spare time for the last 2.5 years. I'm a Blink core owner, a WebKit committer, and I've prototyped and implemented everything I'm going to talk about in WebKit and part of it in Blink. So let's start out from the beginning. What is responsive images? Show of hands, how many of you know what the responsive images problem is? Okay, that's good. That's good. So I like to define it as efficiently loading properly dimensioned images that fit the page's design. And I like to put the emphasis here on the word efficient because otherwise it would be easy. The goal here is performance. The goal here is to avoid downloading image data that we do not need. So a few words about how it all began. So if we go back to ancient history, so mid-2000s, all we had when it comes to the web on mobile was mobile-only websites. M.sites redirection towards sites that are dedicated to mobile devices and were by definition trimmed down experiences. All of that changed in 2007 when the iPhone came around and basically broke the barriers between the mobile web and the real web, the desktop websites, creating a single web that's a continuum across devices. And following the iPhone came a lot of other devices with various form factors, various viewport sizes. So the old technique of tailoring the website to a specific device was no longer cutting it. The web development community's response to that and the browser's response to that was responsive web design, which is still based on media queries, which was a browser feature used as part of this technique, which was new at the time, fluid grids, and flexible images. And by flexible images, what we're talking about is images that are defined relative to the viewport or relative to elements that are relative to the viewport, and that are just sent. So we're just sending the largest possible images down to the browser and letting the browser deal with it. And as far as from a design perspective, that was a job well done. That was working well. But we, as the community, the development community, soon discovered this wasn't working all that well for everyone outside of the broadband high-end devices world, because the result was a very bloated user experience, very bloated websites, and responsive web design soon became a synonym to slow web design, to bloated websites. The reason for that was that 72% of the websites were serving the same resources regardless of the viewport. Most of these resources were images, and a ton of that could have been saved. A lot of data could have been saved by resizing the images to fit their actual display dimensions. So what we've seen is data plan abuse. We've seen that our users are paying for the fact that we're sending them extra data they do not need. And they were also paying for that with their time. and again, responsive websites were slow. So the development community started talking about it in blog posts, and which then moved to the various standard mailing lists and started discussing various proposals regarding how can we solve this? How can we make responsive web design performant when it comes to images? There were a lot of proposals, a lot of suggestions from a lot of developers, and eventually, because this discussion was kind of derailing and creating a lot of noise on the standard mailing lists, the Responsive Images Community Group was born in order to have a dedicated forum to have this discussion. The developer community hashed it out for a few months and came up with the picture proposal, which was originally proposed by Bruce Lawson from Opera and was fairly widely adopted. It mimicked, in a way, the video attribute. Then, or more or less at the same time, an engineer from Apple proposed the source set attribute, a solution to a subset of the problem on the WhatWD mailing list. And after a very short period of time, Ian Hickson, the WhatWD HTML editor, added that proposal with a bunch of other use cases retrofitted into that proposal into the HTML spec. The developer community was not pleased. There were a lot of flame wars over this on the mailing lists, and for a while there was this picture versus source set debate, which was basically taking the two solutions side by side and looking at which one of them solves the problem better. But as the community group soon realized, actually picture and source set were resolving slightly different use cases. They were complementary solutions rather than solutions that are competing on the same slot. But browsers were still hung up on the picture versus source set, and let's see who would win. So they were basically sitting, waiting for the debate to hash out and have a winner which they can implement. So for a long while, nothing happened. We did a lot of work at the community group, prototyping the picture proposal, talking to the HTML working group, creating a spec, a use case document, getting everything to first public working draft status at the W3C, but nothing substantial have happened in terms of actual implementation. Then, after a while, we were able to convince John Mellor from Google that this is an actual issue needs resolving, which he then talked about with Tab Atkins, the legend says, over a few bottles of wine. And they came up with the source end proposal, which was rejected by browser vendors, but the revolution there was, beyond the fact that there was some major innovation there in terms of the solution to the responsive images problem, but the main differentiator here was that it was a proposal coming from browser people, coming from people that work for browser vendors. And the result of that was that a lot of more proposals were showing up on the standard mailing lists, this time for browser vendors, this time from browser folks. at the end, I've had an RSC chat with Simon Peters from Opera, and we figured out a way to gather up all the good pieces from all the proposals, so from picture, from the original source set, and from source N, wrap it up into a single coherent syntax. And in the process, we got rid of the major hurdles to the picture implementation. So the new proposal was significantly easier to specify, significantly easier to implement and to maintain. But it looked very much like the original picture proposal. It's just that we've changed the internal mechanisms so that they would work in a simpler way. And Tab Atkins from Google then revived the spec, and we've been working on it with Tab and Simon ever since. This proposal, Mozilla were very positive regarding this proposal, but Blink, the rendering engine behind Chrome and Opera, resisted the proposal on some implementation grounds. There was some infrastructure missing from the engine that made it difficult to implement. So I had a couple of options: either wait for a couple of years for this infrastructure to get built, or build it myself. So I took the second option, started working on it, and since I've seen that it's gonna take a long while to do that as part of my evening and weekend pastime activity, we've decided at the group to go and crowdfund the implementation effort, which went well. And we've got patches landing, and now the Blink work is done, and WebKit is almost there. There's some infrastructure missing from WebKit. And we're shipping in Chrome 38, which is, there's no official release date, but it should be out somewhere in the, let's say, up to from here till mid-October. It should be out in the wild. And it's important to say that it was a group effort, which was as awesome as standard development can get. We were gathered up on a single IRC, browser developers, web developers, and people from various browsers, even Microsoft folks came by. So it was a very good experience as far as web standard development goes. Now let's take a look at what this proposal is. What's the syntax we're talking about? So the proposal, the feature is comprised of 3 parts. The first part is the X descriptor of the source set attribute. That's the oldest part of the spec, the part that was the original Apple proposal on the YWG mailing list. And the use case here is retina images. So loading high-resolution images only on high-resolution devices. And it's impacting mostly fixed-width images. And the syntax is fairly simple. You still have the SRC attribute on the image tag. You have to specify it for backward compatibility. And it specifies the 1x, the normal resolution display resource. And then you have the source set attribute with a comma delimited list of pairs of URL, image URL, and a descriptor that indicates its DPR, its resolution. So that's fairly simple. And just as an example, let's say you have you want to have an article about cats, obviously, because it's the internet, with a fixed width image that accompanies it. So on a wider viewport, it would look like this. And on a narrower viewport, it will look like this. OK, this is a bit narrower than predicted. But basically, the image is the same dimensions on both type of devices. So you just want to serve higher resolution images to high resolution devices so that the cat will not look blurry. That's it. That's what this use case is handling. Moving on to the next one, the picture part, the part that requires multiple elements, the part that looks like video. The main use case here is art direction. So basically adapting the image to the design breakpoint so that its subject, for example, here in cropping, its subject gets more focus because if we would just adapt the image, downsize the image on narrow viewports, the subject of the image, the guy rowing, would look tiny. So that's the classical example here is cropping for narrower viewports or narrower designs. And the second use case is MIME type fallback. Because whether we like it or not, the web today is fragmented when it comes to image formats. Google has WebP, Microsoft has JPEG XR, and everyone supports the old 3 legacy formats, JPEG, GIF, and it's GIF, not GIF, I'm sorry. And PNGs. But where was I? But unlike other formats, unlike videos, unlike fonts, we have, or up until today, we did not have a fallback mechanism, a client-side fallback mechanism for that. So picture gives us that. It gives us the ability, even if we don't have the ability to set up server-side mechanisms, to set up content negotiation, we can still use the newer file formats, WebP and JPEG XR, assuming IE will implement picture, on our websites, even if we're hosting the images on GitHub and we have no control on the server side, for example. So just an overview of the syntax. The most important part, the part we should start out with, is the image. Because, as I said, unlike the original picture proposal, the image tag is still driving everything here. The image tag is the one displaying the image. So, and the image tag here is same as it always were. It still should have an SRC attribute in order to have a fallback mechanism for older browsers. It should have the alt attribute. And once the image is added to the DOM, basically in the process of selecting which resource to download, it looks up to see what its parent is. And if it has a picture parent, he just starts walking the source children of that parent and basically picks the first one that matches, where matching is defined by the media attribute. So if there is a matching media query as part of the media attribute, or a matching type attribute, as we'll see in the next example. And once we've found a source tag that matches, we take its source attribute and use that in order to pick the best resource. So just an example here for another example of our direction that, as you can see, it's from the Nokia Migo launch. So that's how long we've been doing this. So, but an example for our direction other than the usual cropping stuff is just here, for example, you can see that they're adapting the way that they show the device according to the width of the viewport. So if the viewport is wide, they're showing it in landscape, and otherwise they're showing it in portrait. So just a quick overview of the MIME type fallback syntax. So here it's the same thing as we've seen before, only with the type attribute. So starting out from the image tag, from the image element, going up to picture, and then walking its sources until we find the first source that matches. That will give us, and then this is the resource that the browser will download, and gives us a decent fallback mechanism for various MIME types. So going to the third part of the most exciting part, in my view, of the syntax, the part that was added with the source and proposal, the sizes attribute and the source set W descriptor. And the use case here is variable width images. Images that have their width relative to the viewport or relative to an element who has its width relative to the viewport. And the important thing to notice here is that it does not mean that because responsive web design can have different design per device and per viewport, not per device, but per viewport size, narrow viewports like this phone in this example can have larger images than mid-size devices who have more columns of smaller images, for example, in this example. So we can have images that are larger on smaller devices. The syntax to handle this looks kind of scary at first, but it's fairly easy once you get to know how to read it. So let's start out with the easy part, with the source set part. That part looks very much like what we've seen with the X descriptors. That's a comma delimited list of URL and descriptor pairs. The W descriptor simply says what the resource width is in pixels. So pick 100 here is 100 pixel wide. Pick 800 is an 800 pixel wide image. Okay. Then there's the sizes attribute. And the reason for which we need the sizes attribute is that we cannot, the browser cannot know what would be the display size of the image at the time that it picks which image resource to download. Otherwise, we would have to wait too long in order for CSS to be applied. And even then, the download size of once we download some images, they can impact the dimensions of other images, which would result in double downloads, and it would start the download way too late. So what we have here, what the sizes attribute is a hinting mechanism for the browser. We tell the browser, this particular image, this is what its display dimensions would be. So, and we have the syntax itself uses media conditions. It's basically, again, a list of comma delimited pairs with a media condition, an optional media condition, as the first item of the pair. A media condition is like a media query just without the type. So no screen end at the top. But we can, so this part, the browser goes over the list and looks at the media condition. If the media condition matches, then this is the length. The second item is a CSS length. In this case, 100 VW means 100% of the viewport. So if the media condition matches, the browser picks this length and uses that as the length to determine which resource it should download. If it doesn't match, it goes on to the next one. And you can see in the third row here that we don't have a pair here. It's just a CSS length. So when the media condition is not there, it's a match. And this is the fallback value that gets picked. So in this case, what we see, what the browser would go, what this expression means, what this size expression means, is that when the max width is 30 EM, so when the viewport is smaller than 480 pixels, the image that would be picked would be 100. The image length would be 100% of the viewport. Sorry. When the viewport is between 480 pixels and 800 pixels, so between 30 and 50 EMs, the image width would be 50 VW, 50% of the viewport. And otherwise, it would be a third of the viewport minus 100 pixels that we're reserving for gutters or whatever. And just a simple example here, if we go back to the CAT article, that would just be an image with sizes of 50 VW. So the image is 50% of the viewport, and for narrow viewports, we would display it just 50% of the narrow viewport. And we would download only a smaller resource that is only 50% of the viewport. And all that syntax can be combined together. So we can have a picture element with a source that has, for certain breakpoints, a fixed width image with an X descriptor, and for other viewports, sizes, and a W descriptor source set that represents variable width images. Okay, so there's a lot of mixing and matching here. There's a great article by Andreas Bovens from Opera regarding all the permutations of options that you may or may not want to do with this set of solutions for responsive images. So moving on from syntax, support, browser support. As I said, Blink and Opera, everything I've shown here is supported in Chrome 38, Opera 25, which are now in beta and should be out in, let's say, 3 weeks or so. Firefox, Mozilla were implementing along with us along with their responsive images community group. They were on IRC all times. We worked together with them, talked about the issues as they came along, implementation stuff. And the original plan was for them to ship in Firefox 33, so in a few weeks, but it got postponed. So now hopefully the plan is to land it for Firefox 34, which is a month and a half later. IE, as I said, are showing interest and showing up on IRC, but the official response is they're looking into it. So let's hope it will make it for IE 13. Who knows? And Safari. So Safari have the X descriptor shipped already. It was implemented. Actually, it was that was the initial implementation. The first implementation that went into a rendering engine was the sourceset X descriptor in WebKit. But they're going to ship it for Safari 8. Sizes and sourceset are fully implemented, but are not going to ship in Safari 8. There is no official Apple response regarding anything, so this is not different. They're going to ship it when they're going to ship it. And regarding the picture part of the implementation, there is some WebKit infrastructure missing that I need to make up for, but I will get to that. Now, let's talk a little bit about what should developers do with all that. How do responsive images impact you? So a question we get a lot is whether or not to polyfill picture, because there is a standard compliant polyfill called picture fill by Scott Gell and from the Filament group, which is working well, and I think that for most cases, you would probably want to use that. You'd probably want to use the polyfill. There are some talks about the fact that the inherent fallback mechanism makes it so that you don't have to use a polyfill, which is true. You would just fall back to the old behavior of just the image SRC, a single image resource. But since the polyfill is not huge, there are no major disadvantages. But basically, so I would say use the polyfill unless there's something that's preventing you from using it. Another question that, again, arises from the early roots of the picture versus sourceset battle. What should developers use, picture or sourceset? Because you could, in theory, abuse picture in order to do a lot of the viewport variable with images use case. It would take a lot more work and it will be less flexible, but you could do that. But the common advice here is if you're doing art direction, use picture. Otherwise, you're most probably better off using sourceset and sizes. One gotcha that you should look out for is that source order matters. So since, as I said, basically the algorithm is a first match algorithm. You need to place the narrowest breakpoint first. Otherwise, so for example, if we'll replace the 18 and the 45, 45 will never get picked because everything that matches min width 45 also matches min width 18. So you need to be careful on the way you order your sources. The same goes for the sizes attribute. Again, narrow breakpoint must go first. Otherwise, here, 30 EM will never get picked because 50 EM covers it as well. Another thing to note is that the default value of sizes is 100 VW, so 100% of the viewport. That means that by default, if you omit sizes, the size of the resource that the browser will pick will be the largest resource that fits the viewport. So that kind of makes sense. You can look at it as if sizes is an extra optimization step that you can omit, and you would still get something out of the source set. Not that you should omit it, but it's an extra step, a sensible default. Another thing is intrinsic sizing. the value of the descriptor you're giving the browser is used in order to determine what would be the size of the image displayed if the browser has no other indications. So if you didn't specify height and width in CSS, the browser will take the physical image dimensions and divide them by the X descriptor. Same goes for the W descriptor. If you're giving the browser wrong W descriptors for a certain resource, it will be displayed smaller or larger than it actually is if you don't indicate any dimensions otherwise. And as far as styling goes, you should consider it as if nothing has changed. All your old styles that were applied to the image tag should still apply to the image tag. Picture is simply a wrapper around it. It's a span. You should consider it a span. So if you want to style a span around it, you can style picture. But nothing in your styles should change in that aspect. Same goes for alt text. It's the same. It should go on image, and that's it. We have put in place feature detection options so you can safely detect from script whether or not the browser supports picture and sizes. So either the HTML picture element object or a sizes attribute on a newly created HTML image element. And we also added a property called current SRC, which gives you the resource that was currently picked by the browser to display. That can be useful in some cases. And a couple of words regarding yet another proposal that didn't yet make it. Client hints, which is a proposal by Ilya Grigorik from Google. And it's a content negotiation-based proposal. So the client sends out hints along with the request, hints and capabilities. So DPR, RW. And so RW is the resource width that was used for same one that's used in the sizes attribute. So if the sizes attribute defines one, it sends out the one defined by sizes. If it doesn't, it sends out the 100% of the viewport. And there are talks about adding also some sort of a maximal bandwidth indication. I don't know where this will go. The problem here is that content negotiation features have a bad rep among browser folks, and a lot of browser people oppose to content negotiation in general. So this feature has seen some opposition on that grounds. And currently, Mozilla are not very excited about it. So we're not sure where it would go. So just to sum it up, responsive images, they're coming very soon. In a few weeks, it will be in stable browser in Chrome and Opera, which in terms of market share, also in mobile, it's huge. So you guys should prepare for that and optimize your websites. Avoid all the costs, all the pain of image bloat from your users. So thank you.
So there's a break right now, but we can have some questions because you have until 3:30 until the next talk.
Yeah.
So picture is lazy loading, right? It only loads the images that are that your browser has determined it's going to use. Is that right?
Yes, but it's not lazy loading them.
Not
It's
lazy
loading.
Selective loading, not lazy loading.
Yeah.
Selective loading. Done.
It's
Right.
yeah. It loads only the images that your browser needs at the moment.
Right. And then, but what happens if for like orientation change? Do you do?
Yeah. For orientation changes, yes, the user will reload the second image, which assuming that it's defined as our direction. This is the desired behavior because otherwise the layout of the page can break. Yeah. So from a radio network perspective, we're aware of the fact that it's not ideal, but this is what, I mean, if developers are using picture for our direction, this is what they need in order for the site to be displayed as intended. When source set is displayed, I mean, when source set is used, in this case, the browser detecting that the radio network is down can choose not to download the higher quality image and avoid this download in order to avoid wasting battery life and loading the network. That's the liberty we deliberately gave the browser in everything related to source set because it's just quality changes. But everything picture, where our direction is involved, yeah, there will be a second download if on an orientation.
What about the possibility of prefetching the horizontal picture?
Theoretically, browsers can do that if they find it necessary, yes.
Is it done automatically, the reloading, or should I put the listener to orientation change?
If you're using our direction, you don't need to put a listener. The question was, is the reloading of the images on an orientation change done automatically? So if you're doing our direction, yes. For anything else, it's the browser's decision, and you can put listeners on orientation change and do whatever you want, just as you can always do.
So
Yes.
how does this new element impact the browser's own image preloading functionality?
The part of the image implementation, part of the infrastructure missing from Blink was an infrastructure required in order to make sure that the preloading process handles this well. So since all the information required for media queries is available on preload time for the majority, for let's say practically all cases, we're now in Blink. I've implemented media query evaluation in the preloader so that preloading just works with picture and the right resource is picked.
In terms of performance, have you found that when there's lots of picture elements on a page and people are putting lots of media queries inside those picture elements, is there like a limit where it starts to, the browser has to work out too much and actually slows things down, or is it a...
We didn't find any benchmarks that indicated that this is a problem. And multiple media queries are in general, there is this myth, but it's in general, media queries are cheap. It's not expensive.
Let's do one more question, if someone has one. Okay.
I'm working on an e-commerce site, and lazy loading is pretty important for me because I don't want to kick off 300 images on the catalog page, right? And I want to implement picture element quite soon. So any advices how to go there, or are there plans to deal with lazy loading?
So first of all, in terms of, if you're talking web standards, there are proposals that would handle lazy loading and would enable declarative markup lazy loading. You should not wait for those. There's no one knows what's gonna happen with that. There are tons of JavaScript libraries that do lazy loading. There are none that are adapted to work with picture, as far as I know. So what I would suggest is that you would adapt one of those and or adapt picture fill to somehow do both. There is a prototype guy called David Newton wrote he added lazy loading into picture fill, but I'm not sure it's very production ready. It was more of a so we would love to have someone work on that. Yes.
All right, let's thank you one more time.